Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and for my Photoshop video training series, I'm going to cover the essentials of layers and masks, specifically for photographers. So I'm starting out in Lightroom here, and you can see I have a nice picture of Stockholm. But the sky is kind of washed out, and the foreground here is way too dark. Looking at the histogram, you can see the exposure is good. This is a raw file, unedited. The exposure is good. All the data is captured there, but it's not being presented very well. First thing I'm going to do is make another copy of this. We're going to get to layers and masks in just a second. I just want to show you one of my favorite tricks, which is combining a picture with itself. So now that I have two copies of the same image, one virtual copy, I'm going to bring this first one into the develop module. And for this one, I'm just going to make this sky look nice. So the sky's a little bright right now. I'm just going to bring the exposure down. You can see, there's so much nice color and texture in the sky, and that's just much more as how I remembered it. So I might also bring the vibrance up a little bit. Just bring the colors more to the way I remember them, because it was just a beautiful sunset this day. So let's crank those colors up a little bit. That's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll bring the whites up just a hair. Okay, so popping back to the second. Now that I have one picture with this sky that looks good, now let's make this foreground look good, because you can see it's just way too dark here. So I'm just going to crank the whole exposure up. There we go. Maybe I'll drop the blacks a little bit. I still want plenty of contrast in there. Let's see, maybe a little bit of clarity here. So now I've got two copies of the same picture. You can see one has a great sky, one has a great foreground. I'm going to select them both, right click, and then edit in, and then go down to open as layers in Photoshop. It's going to handle the creation of the layers automatically for me. It's just going to stack those two copies of the exact same picture. Over in the right part of the Photoshop window here, by default, we see the two layers, and right now there's layer 0. Okay, there we go. It's adding in the second layer as we speak. It's an automated process of doing that. If you don't see the layers panel down there, it can disappear. Go to the window menu and then select layers. So now both the images here are stacked, but we only see the one image with the sky. And that's because a layer will hide any layers that are underneath it. So they're both in there, but the second layer is completely hidden. I can show the underlying layer by clicking this eye here. Whenever this eye is visible in the layer section, then that layer will be visible. So by clearing that, that layer becomes invisible, revealing the underlying layer. If I were to clear both, of course we see this checkerboard pattern, which indicates nothing is there. Now, if I wanted to, I could resize one of these. I hit Control T, which opens up a transform, and then I could resize it. And this kind of lets us see that there really are two pictures stacked on top of each other. Of course, we don't want that, so I'll hit Escape to cancel it. Now the trick is showing the right parts of each of the two pictures. And there's one way to do this without using masks, and it's not a good way. But I'll show you. There's the eraser tool over here. So as I select that eraser tool, and I'm going to hit right bracket to make my brush really big, I can just erase that top layer, and I could just go in here and erase it. But what if I screw up and I just go way too far? What do I do now? Well, it's not that easy, because the eraser is not so easily reversible. If I were to save it and reopen it, I wouldn't be able to undo it. So instead of, I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that, instead of using kind of a permanent tool like the eraser, I can use masks, which allow me to choose which part of each layer is visible and which parts are hidden. So I don't know why they make these icons so tiny, but you'll see this one way down here is the layer mask icon. So with that top layer selected, I'm going to hit that icon, and nothing changed, right? It added a mask here, and you can see there's a little link indication. So this picture is linked to this mask, and the mask is all white. So if I hold down the Alt key and I hit that, I see my mask, which is all white. So I'll hide that again. Now what we can do with the mask is paint over the mask to make parts of it black. So I'm going to use just a brush tool. I'm literally just going to be drawing blackness over it. And then I'm going to make it black by just hitting this double arrow thing here. This shows you the color that you're painting right now, this white block there. So by switching them, I switched the white for the black, and now I'm painting black. Just by way of example, if I were to paint black over the sky, that's what I would get. But I don't want to paint over the picture, I want to paint over the mask. So now any place I paint in the mask, I'm going to be showing the underlying layer. So there you can see I'm revealing the underlying layer. So let's undo that. And now our task is to do a good job of painting the mask so that everything looks really nice. And this part gets pretty complex because selecting in Photoshop is such a challenge that there are people whose careers are just creating good selections. There are people who work in big photo editing houses who just are experts at selecting things. It's amazing that that's how big of a job it is, but there are tools that make it pretty easy for you. And my favorite tool is the quick selection tool. This works better than just about anything else. And with the quick selection tool, what I want to do now is I'm just going to go in and select the foreground here just as best as I can. And you can see it's not being perfect. So I'm going to rough it, and then I'm going to go back and refine it a little bit better. These areas where it did a bad job, I'm going to hit the Alt key and click in there just to unselect those parts. So without holding down the Alt key, we'll add it to the selection, and when you hold the Alt key, it will remove it from the selection. So I'm removing these unwanted parts. And right now this is just a selection. So I could just delete all of this. But rather than do that, what I'll do instead is use the masking. So, as long as we have that selection here, I want to show you a trick. I'm going to delete that layer mask by right-clicking it. And with the selection enabled, I'm going to hit layer mask here, and it will automatically create a layer mask for me. However, it did it backwards. So I'm going to hit Control Z, and I'll go to Select Menu, and then I'm going to Inverse, which you could also do Shift Control I. So now that the selection is inverted, if I create a layer mask, you can see that's pretty good. It did a pretty good job of masking that. Now, with this sort of manual selection, obviously this was kind of roughed in, and I didn't spend the time to try to refine it, but still, it doesn't quite have a natural look. What you see are very harsh transitions, and those kind of indicators will tell the eye that the image has been post-processed, and that's something we always want to avoid with an image, obviously post-processing it. We could just run this through an HDR tool if we didn't mind it looking post-processed, but we want it to look natural. So let's forget this mask. Let's forget carefully selecting everything, because when you do that, it's always going to end up imperfect, especially if you have trees. One of the most common problems I see with landscape photos is somebody tried to replace the sky, but the selections are bad or the leaves are bad in a tree because they're just too fine. So let's just get rid of this mask. So now I have the gradient tool selected and create a mask. So first we're just going to look at the mask. And as I draw the gradient tool, you can see wherever I click first, it draws the foreground color, and wherever I end clicking, it draws the background color, and it does a nice transition from one to the other. So I actually want the top part to be white and the bottom part to be black. So I did that backwards because I forgot I switched these tools. So I'm going to switch back to black and white here. So now it's white here and black here. And let's display this so I know exactly where to click. I'm just going to smoothly transition from the background to the foreground right about here. And, oh, I painted it on the main mask, or on the main layer. Let's select the mask there and redo it. Okay, so that looks pretty good, but you can see it still looks pretty obvious. There's some pretty obvious haloing here around the building, just because the gradient was too rapid. I didn't spread the gradient over a big enough area. So let's undo that, and we'll try it again. Okay, this is getting better and better. I think, let's see. The gradient's always going to be at a right angle to the line that I draw. Okay, so here, this is looking pretty good, I think. And if I wanted to do any fine tuning, I certainly could do it by just editing this mask here. And in fact, I do, because as I hide this layer, you'll see that the balloon looks way better in the more brightly exposed picture than it does in the underexposed picture. So I'm going to try to get this mask taken from the bottom layer here, and I'm going to do that by using the layer mask here. This will show you just the layer mask, and I'm going to just paint black over where the balloon is so it shows through and shows me the bottom layer. Anytime you want to see the layer mask, just as a reminder, hold down your Alt key or your Option key on a Mac and click that layer mask. That just reveals what it actually looks like. So now we have the task of trying to select around this balloon. And as we showed you before, selecting can be kind of difficult. So I hit Control-Alt-0 to zoom in 1 to 1, and now I'm holding on the space bar and using that to pan over to this balloon. Look at that vignetting. Not vignetting, but chromatic aberration. Okay, so now we're going to try to select the balloon. The gradient tool probably won't work here because it's just too small of an object. I've selected it, and I need to refine this selection a little bit. So I'm going to go to the selection tool and then select Refine Edge. And this allows Photoshop to use some of its smarts to make it look a little bit better. So I like to do the edge detection a little bit and just increase the radius. And a little bit of feathering will really help out here too. And a little smoothing might help as well. Okay, so you can see it's showing me just the parts that are selected. Everything else is blanked out. If I want to see the original, I can click that checkbox. I can also change the view here to see it viewed in different ways. These are just different ways to see the selection that you're currently working on. So seeing it on white, it looks pretty good to me here. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now I've got just the balloon selected. What I'm going to do is just fill this area in, the selected area, with the paint bucket. Or, you know, even easier, I'll just use a brush and just paint black really big. Oh, I need to paint in the layer mask. You'll make that mistake too. So let's paint black there. I'm painting white. Switch back to black. Okay, so now I'm finally painting black in the layer mask. And you can see that bottom layer is shining right through. There we go. So I can hit Control-D to deselect and just to hide those marching ants a little bit. So as we zoom back out, I'm going to hit Control-Z to fill the screen with it. You can see it looks pretty good. And I can look at the layer mask by alt-clicking the layer mask. And you can see my gradient here and the black part that I carved out of it. But it looks a little unnatural, right? So Control-Alt-Z to zoom in 1 to 1 again, and I'll just pan over. And it looks unnatural because too much of the edge is shining through. So that chromatic aberration is super bright against the dark sky, and it looks unnatural because it is unnatural, right? But with masks, it's really easy to paint back just a little bit more. So I'm going to, I want to paint the mask white, right? Because I want to show more of the sky and less of the balloon. So I'm going to set this to white, and I'm going to use a brush here. And I want to just touch it up a little bit. Just barely touch the edges of it. And you'll get real used to kind of just touching up your masks like this. And you want to just be real sensitive. And if you screw up and you go too much, hit the X key. The X key is a keyboard shortcut to switch between the white and the black here. So now I'm painting black again, and it makes it real easy just to go back and repaint something that I screwed up. There'll be just lots of back and forth as you're kind of perfecting your mask. And don't be afraid to zoom in past 1 to 1 like I just did. So let's go back to painting in white, and I'll just touch this up a little bit. I'm even going to, I want to soften my brush up some. So I could do that by selecting a bigger brush or by reducing the hardness here just to make a softer edge, something that looks more like this than something that looks like that. And that'll just make it a little more gentle. So again, painting white just to remove some of those edges. If your brush is too heavy, if you find yourself oversteering kind of, take the opacity and just dial it way down. And this will make your adjustments much more gentle. So I'm going to dial that down to 27%. Just want to make sure all that kind of fringing is gone there. Just be as gentle with it as I can. So this is just kind of blending those two layers together a little bit better. So hit Control Z to zoom out, and it's not perfect. I could spend some more time refining that, but you can see it's looking pretty good, and it's certainly looking better than either of the original pictures. And so that's our before, and this is our after. And you can see it's by far better. But I want to do one more thing. I want to add in one more layer by throwing a moon in there. Okay, that could be way too much, right? But still, it'll be an interesting exercise for using layers and masks for something different. In Photoshop, I'm going to hit Control W to close that and then save it. And that'll import it back into Lightroom. And hitting G to jump back to the grid view, we can see my original picture here. So I'm going to take this picture of a moon and my new edited picture, and I'm going to open them as layers just as I did before. All right, so this is looking real natural, right? Yeah, nobody would notice that this was comped. Tell you what, let's actually replace that balloon with the moon. And the way I'll do that is, first I'm going to just remove the balloon entirely. So there's this really cool tool called ContentAware Fill, and I'll start by, let's put a nice little feather, a 3-pixel feather that just softens the edge. First I'm just going to select around this balloon. Now I'll press Shift and Backspace to bring up the Fill tool. And you can see it gives me a couple of options, but the one I want is Content Aware. So let's go ahead and do Content Aware Fill, and you can see Photoshop does a pretty good job of just removing the balloon completely from the sky. So now let's show our moon picture once again, and let's move the moon right where that balloon was. This moon is pretty huge, but we'll deal with that in a second. One way to get rid of the black around the moon would be to use our quick selection tool here and select it, and then either create a mask or just delete it. That still looks a little bit unnatural, but I'll show you an even easier way to do it. Because the background, hitting Control-Alt-Z to step back in time, because the background is black, we can use layer blending, which is a very useful tool for photographers, allowing you to blend multiple layers together. You can experiment with these. There's things like lighten and screen. The screen tool is going to work pretty well for us here in that anything in a screen that's black disappears completely. So all that darkness just kind of faded out. Now this certainly looks better than it did when we had the screen type set to normal, right? So setting that to screen looks much better. It's still a bit much though, because the moon is showing up in front of the atmosphere, and it should be behind the atmosphere and the clouds. And an easy way to adjust that is to just drop the opacity down. So I'm going to grab the opacity here, and if I set it to 0, it disappears completely. So anything in between just kind of fades the moon in, and will just give us a more natural look. So you want to just kind of adjust that. This just allows the atmosphere to kind of show above the moon. Now, of course, that's a bit too big. So we can scale the moon down, and the way I'm going to do that is by transforming that layer. So with this layer selected, I'm going to hit Control-T, and that brings up the transformation. So now I could scale it up or down. To make sure you don't end up with a big egg-shaped moon, hold down the Shift key. The Shift key locks in the proportions of your transformation to make sure that it keeps the same aspect ratio. So one of the biggest mistakes people make is they make the moon way too big in these comps. This was taken at like 30 millimeters maybe, which would mean the moon would be like yay big. We could probably go a little bit bigger than that, but we don't really want to overdo it too much, or we'll just risk having it look completely unrealistic. So I'll hit the Enter key to lock in that transformation. So please don't take this as me telling you to Photoshop moons into every landscape. That would be silly. I just wanted to demonstrate the usefulness of using layers and masks to photographers. These are capabilities that just aren't built into Lightroom, but the power of Photoshop makes it very easy to do. And if I save this file, I can go back and edit it later, and those layers will still be intact along with all the masks. So if you decide you wanted to mask something slightly differently, you wouldn't have to go back and recreate everything. Layers and masks stay intact as long as you save the file as a TIFF or a D. For more videos like this, be sure to subscribe and give us a like and share it with your friends. If you want to know more about photography, check out Stunning Digital Photography. And we don't have a Photoshop book out yet, but it will be out soon. So in the meantime, you can read our Lightroom books. Thanks so much.